It was the week before Christmas in a small Minnesota town. The kitchen smelled like sugar and butter. The holiday music was on. The baking supplies are already laid out on the counter. Chocolate, almonds, little bits and pieces of a tradition that's been happening in this household for years. A mother's waiting for her daughter to walk through the door so they can make their annual Christmas candies together. The same ones they make every single year. She's made dinner. She's got everything ready, and all she needs is her daughter. But the hours pass. The food gets cold. The ingredients sit untouched. And somewhere across the river, on a frozen December night, in a dark alley, a man notices a strange glow coming from a nearby car. He grabs his fire extinguisher and runs outside, and he pulls open the car door. And what he finds stops him cold. And it will stop you too. A young woman in the back seat, no coat, no shoes, on a night where the temperature has dropped well below zero. Nobody leaves the house like that. Not in Minnesota, not in December, which means whatever happened to her didn't happen here. It happened somewhere she felt safe, somewhere warm, and someone made sure she never made it back home. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 71 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyrleigha, and I'm here with my co-host doing the most, my lovely husband, Jonathan.
Hi. Darklivity is the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
You'd really do the most. You set everything up. You help with everything here. We wouldn't even be able to do it if it wasn't for you. But that also means he forgets to turn things on, like the microphones or a light, then we have to re-record sometimes. Behind the scenes, you have no idea. Did you see that Hope from Hope Scope was wearing our sweatshirt in one of her latest videos?
Oh, wow.
I'm going to put it up on the screen. Don't forget to get yours. The Trust No One Club, we'll link it below. It should be right under our video. You can just click right on the picture and you can see all of our merchandise. And we don't say it enough, but please like this video, subscribe if you haven't done so already. We are so close to hitting 100,000 subscribers, which is a pretty amazing milestone. It really is. Like the silver play button. We're so close. So share us with your friends. But let me take you back to that alley now. A local Minnesota man saw a car on fire and he jumped into action. His hands were shaking as he aimed the fire extinguisher at the flames. He gets the fire down enough to pull the car door open, and that is when he sees her, a young woman, motionless in the back seat, slumped over, her skin pale against the dark. And he pulls her out, desperate, hoping that he's not too late. But he already knows. Anyone would have. He is too late. His wife calls 911, and within minutes, Minneapolis police are on their way. Among the first called to the scene is Sergeant Chris Gators, who had been home with his family just a little while earlier. They were carefully stringing lights on their Christmas tree while the kids watched with their wide eyes. And then he takes the call, tells his children he's got to go, and steps out into that freezing cold night. He will later say he remembered that moment vividly, the warmth of his own living room, the excitement on his kids' faces, and then the cold reality of what waited for him across the city.
The case is handed to veteran homicide detective Sergeant Rick Zimmerman and his partner Sergeant Tammy Diedrich.
And it really is Zimmerman and not Zimmerman.
When they arrive, the alley is already blocked off with crime scene tape, the charred vehicle surrounded by officers and fire personnel. The smell of smoke hangs heavy in this frozen air. Neighbors stand bundled at the ends of their driveways, whispering, trying to make sense of what happened on their street just days before Christmas. What strikes the detectives immediately, even before a single interview, are two things: the ligature marks around the young woman's neck and the fact that she has no coat, no shoes. And in Minneapolis in December, to anyone who has spent a winter in Minnesota, that detail alone tells a story. She didn't come here on her own. She was brought here. And wherever she came from, she never got the chance to leave on her terms.
They don't know her name yet, but they're about to find out. And when they do, the question that will consume the next several days and ultimately the next year is not just who she was. It's who had done this to her and why. She did have a name. It's Kristine Larson. And if you're going to understand why this case matters, why it stuck with so many of the detectives who worked on it, you need to know who she actually was. Not just the 19-year-old who was found in a burning car the week before Christmas. The whole person, the real one. So let's go back to the beginning. Kristine Catherine Larson came into this world on February 8th of 1988 to Douglas and Deborah Larson. And from the very first moment her mother laid eyes on her, she was already making an impression. Deborah looked down at this new baby, her round cheeks, and she thought she looked like a cherub. And the nickname came instantly. She called her baby Buddha, a little girl so plump and peaceful and full of some kind of quiet joy that even as a newborn, she made the people around her feel something special. That was Kristine from day one. That energy, that warmth, that way of pulling people toward her. It didn't develop over time. She actually arrived with it.
Eventually, and unfortunately, Kristine's mom and dad separated, and her mother remarried a man named Daniel Tilson. So Kristine ended up being raised in a blended household. That kind of household that's loud and busy and full of the kind of chaos that comes from having a lot of kids under one roof. Deborah and her husband built a family that included Kristine's biological sisters, Michelle and Teresa, her brother Eric, and now 2 stepbrothers, Alex and Brian. So 6 kids in total, one house, constant motion, and somehow in the middle of all that noise and energy and the everyday drama of a big family, Kristine still found a way to stand out.
Her sister Michelle described her as 1 in a million, and I want to pause on that for a second because I know that phrase gets used a lot. We hear it in cases like this all the time, and I've talked about this before. The way certain descriptions start to feel like they've kind of lost their meaning because we hear them so many times. But here's the thing. When Michelle said 1 in a million about her sister, she wasn't reaching for a compliment. She was trying to explain something that was genuinely hard to put into words. The way Kristine occupied a space that nobody else could fill. The way a room felt different when she was in it. The way people who had just met her, or maybe met her only once, remembered her years later. That's not cliche. It's just the truth about certain people. And Kristine was one of them. From the time she was small, Kristine had this quality that I think is pretty rare. She made people feel like they were important, not just liked, not just included, but genuinely noticed.
She was the kind of person who would clock it immediately if someone on the edges of a group was feeling left out, and she would do something about it. She'd pull them in, start a conversation, make a joke, find that thing that connected them to everyone else in the room. For Kristine, being surrounded by people was never about being the center of attention for its own sake. It was about connection, real connection. The kind where you leave a conversation feeling like someone actually heard you. We all kind of need a friend like that.
We do. And I feel like that is rare. Like a lot of people, they're waiting for you to finish your sentence so that they can jump in and be like, oh my gosh, me too. And we're all guilty of that as well. But she loved to gather people together. If there was an excuse to celebrate something, Kristine found it. A birthday, obviously. Holidays, of course. But even just a sunny afternoon, a friend's good news, a random Tuesday that needed to be made into something more. She was the one sending the text messages, making the plans, and rallying everyone together to show up. But here's what keeps her from being just a list of sweet qualities. Kristine also had that spark. Her friends called it a Spitfire streak, and it only added to her charm.
She was bold, she was quick-witted, she had a sharp sense of humor, and she was not afraid to use it. She could banter with anyone, she could tease the people she loved, and even walk into a room and make an ordinary night feel electric just by being present. She had that kind of confidence. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't a performance, just this settled, genuine confidence that made other people want to follow her lead.
She was also strikingly beautiful. Her smile was the first thing people noticed, bright and wide, the kind that reached her eyes and made you feel like you were the reason she was smiling. And then it was her green eyes. But most of all, she carried herself in a way that turned heads without even having to try. And the thing that people who knew her always came back to was that she seemed completely unaware of it.
But her looks were just part of the package. What drew people to Kristine wasn't her appearance, it was everything underneath it.
I like to understand the world that a person lived in, not just the town though, but the specific chapter of their life that they were in. She was 19 years old because I think context matters in cases like this. The texture of someone's everyday life, the rhythm of their week, the people that they leaned on, and the places they felt safe. It all becomes important when you're trying to piece together how something like this that was so devastating could happen. But to understand that part, we do need to know where she grew up. the atmosphere that shaped her into who she was, that led Kristine to where she was in her life. So let's talk about St. Paul Park first, and then we'll talk about Kristine's life inside of it.
St. Paul Park, Minnesota sits quietly along the western bank of the Mississippi River, tucked just south of St. Paul in Washington County. It's not the kind of place that shows up in travel guides or makes headlines. It doesn't have a famous landmark or a bustling downtown strip. What it has is something more understated than that, a genuine sense of community. The kind that develops slowly over generations in a place where families put down roots and stay, where the same last names appear on mailboxes decade after decade, and where people know each other not by their face, but by their history.
The streets are lined with modest, well-kept homes. Driveways hold minivans and pickup trucks. Front yards have garden beds that get tended to in the summer and snowblowers that come out in the winter. It is in the best possible way an ordinary place, and I mean that as a compliment. There's just something deeply valuable about the ordinary, about knowing your neighbors, about feeling like the place you live is yours, and it belongs to you, and that you belong to it. And when we're talking about crime in St. Paul Park, it was the kind of thing the residents heard about happening in larger cities. On the north side, the east side of St. Paul, not in their own backyard, not on their quiet streets. People there raised their kids with a sense of security that felt earned, and it felt real. The kind of safety that you don't think about until it's gone.
And then there was the river. The Mississippi ran along the edge of town like a constant, quiet presence, wide and unhurried, marking the boundary between St. Paul Park and the world beyond it. In the warmer months, families gathered along its banks, fishing, boating, walking the shoreline in that long golden evenings of the Minnesota summer. Kids splashed in the shallows, parents sat in lawn chairs and watched the water move. It was that kind of simple, uncomplicated pleasure that people in small communities build their summers around, and St. Paul Park was no different.
Well, we want to be honest with you about the other side of living there, because it's relevant to understanding the full picture. Minnesota winters are not a backdrop. They are a character. If you've ever experienced a true upper Midwest winter, I haven't, it is genuinely different to convey just how total and consuming the cold can be. We're talking about temperatures that routinely drop 10, 15, 20 degrees below zero before you even factor in the wind chill. We're talking about snowstorms that arrive without apologies and bury everything in silence. Roads that become impossible to drive on. Days where the sky is flat and gray and nothing from morning until the early dark of 4 in the afternoon. Weeks that blur together under that heavy, relentless cold. It would be a no for me, but it is also very beautiful. It's the kind of winter that shapes people, that teaches you to prepare, to plan ahead, to never underestimate what the weather can do.
We learned that in Minnesota, you do not leave the house without a coat. You do not get into a car without checking the forecast, and you do not go anywhere in December without boots on your feet. That is not an exaggeration. It's survival instinct baked into anyone who's grown up there.
Exactly. And this is also so important because it goes back to what officers noticed right away, that young woman in the back of the burning car didn't have on a winter coat, and she wasn't even wearing shoes. It plays into how this investigation unfolded, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Now that we understand where Kristine was living, we have to tell you about Christmas, because it's not just a holiday, but part of her world. And remember, I want to understand the world that someone lived within. And you cannot understand Kristine Larson without understanding what December meant in the Larson-Tilson household when she was growing up.
We told you that Minnesota winters are brutal, a cold so deep and unrelenting that it changes the way you move through the world. You plan around it, you dress for it, you brace for it. It's not a gentle winter, it's the kind of winter that tests people. And yet, every December, something shifts. The darkness that came early and stayed late got interrupted by light. Houses draped themselves in strings of colored bulbs, front yards filled with glowing reindeer, inflatable Santas, and handmade decorations that had been passed down through families for generations. Neighbors who had been hunkered down against the cold came outside, bundled in heavy coats and boots, to stand together at parades, tree light ceremonies, and their breath is just visible in the frozen night air. Their kids are clutching cups of hot cocoa and choir singing carols in the dark. And just for 1 month out of that long, cold season, the whole community seemed to exhale and lean into each other. And for a moment, that Minnesota winter meant something more.
For the Larson-Tilson family, Christmas was everything. Deborah loved the season the way some people love a person. fiercely and completely, with the kind of devotion that expressed itself in every little detail. The house filled with the smell of fresh baked cookies and the sound of holiday music from the moment December arrived. She would decorate the tree with full family production. The siblings were there untangling the lights and playfully arguing over who would get to put the star on top. Everyone talking over each other, and the kind of beautiful chaos that only happens when a lot of people who love one another are in the same room at the same time.
Kind of painting the picture of Home Alone. You know that kind of chaos?
Yeah, that is. They had a big house. They had 6 kids.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was chaos, but it's like fun chaos.
And at the center of all of it was Kristine. She was the one suggesting the drives through the neighborhood just to look at the lights. She was the one insisting on the get-together, on a party, or one more reason just to have everybody in the same place at the same time. She made the holidays feel even brighter than they already were, and that's really saying something in a household that already loved Christmas as much as the Larson-Tilsons did.
One of Deborah's most cherished traditions was the annual holiday cookie exchange. Every December, the kitchen transformed. There was a lot of butter and the counters piled up with trays of cookies that would be wrapped in festive paper and given away to friends and neighbors and extended family. It was their way of giving when finances didn't always make giving easy. A plate of cookies wrapped in holiday paper carried something more than just sweetness. It carried love. It carried the message that they were thinking of you, that you mattered, and that this season meant something. And among the many things Kristine and her mother made together every year were their Merry Christmas. And I love this detail so much. They were these whimsical little candies shaped into tiny mice. But they weren't perfect. They were playful, the kind of thing that made people smile before they even tasted them. They weren't about precision or perfection. They were about the act of making them together, side by side in that kitchen, laughing and making a mess and being exactly where they were supposed to be every year without fail. It was their thing, Kristine and her mother, the Merry Christmas, and the kitchen that smelled like chocolate and butter.
I totally thought you did a spelling mistake with Christmas. That's why I was laughing.
Yeah, it really is Christmas. And they just came up with it because I think they just probably accidentally made these things. You know, when you're making cookies as a kid, you're like, oh my gosh, look, it looks like a little mouse.
I love Christmas. Even when Kristine's boyfriend Zachary first moved into the Larson-Tilson household.
And we're going to get to how that happened in a moment.
Deborah had to walk Zach through the family's Christmas rituals from scratch. He hadn't grown up celebrating the holidays the way that they did. Kristine took that on with a whole heart, showing him what December meant in their house, eager to share it with him the way that she shared everything, generously, warmly, and without holding back.
So that is the world that Kristine Larson grew up in. She was only 19 years old in December of 2007, still growing up. This isn't just a story about a young woman who was taken too soon. It's a story about a teenage girl who fell in love, became a mother, and was doing everything in her power to build something real for herself and her son. And that story starts back in high school, in the hallway in St. Paul Park in 2004 with a boy named Zachary Otis Matthews. I told you that we were going to get to her boyfriend, Zach. Kristine was only 16 and Zach was a schoolmate of hers. He was 2 years older than her. And the way it started between them was about as ordinary as it gets. The kind of slow, unremarkable process of two people gradually becoming aware of each other, passing glances in the hallway, casual conversations between classes. And Zach developed a crush on her. That part isn't hard to understand because Kristine was magnetic. She was warm and open and the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome.
What made Kristine different from a lot of people is that she didn't brush him off. Her warmth extended to Zach the way it extended to everyone. She made a little extra room for him, though. She got to know him, and before long, the two of them had moved from classmates to friends to something more.
That first love.
That all-consuming, overwhelming kind that feels like the whole world when you're in the middle of it. Deborah liked Zach. She got to know him. She met a young man who was polite and eager and genuinely fond of her daughter. He made a good impression. He seemed like someone who might be good for Kristine, someone steady, someone trying. Deborah called him an amazing young man.
And when it became clear that Zach's home situation was not exactly stable and that he didn't have a close family network nearby, that his support system was limited, Deborah and her husband Daniel did what came naturally to them. They opened their doors. They had a spare bedroom. They told him he could stay. And just like that, Zach went from Kristine's boyfriend to a fixture in this household. Family dinners, holidays, ordinary evenings on the couch. He was there for all of it. Kristine even walked him through, like you said, all of the traditions in this family, showing him what December meant in their house, sharing her favorite season with the person that she was falling for. He was like a son to them, and their relationship was new and imperfect and full of intensity. That comes with your first love. Then came the news that changed everything. About a year and a half into the relationship, Kristine, who was only 17 years old, found out that she was pregnant. 17, still in high school, still in the early rush of that first serious relationship. And suddenly, the future, which had felt wide open and unhurried, now was in focus. By then, Zach had graduated from high school and had a job as a school bus driver. He was pulling his weight, trying his best, but those first days after finding out that they were going to have a child were hard.
Of course they were. Kristine was scared. She was also characteristically determined. She sat with her mother through long, late-night conversations, talking through every possibility, every option, every consideration, and Deborah was worried. She was worried about her daughter's youth, about the weight of what was coming, about whether this was the right path or not. The conversations were honest, and they were loving, and they were exactly what Kristine needed. And in the end, Kristine decided she wanted to keep her baby. It wasn't an impulsive choice. It was a considered one, made by a young woman who was clear-eyed about what she was signing up for and willing to rise to it. Once Kristine committed to something, she committed completely.
That was just who she was.
And Zach, he was thrilled. He talked about the baby as a turning point, a reason to get even more serious, a chance to prove himself, motivation to become someone Kristine and their child could count on. He made promises and he was ready for it. And the people around them, including Deborah, believed him.
In February of 2006, Darian Charles was born. And from the very first moment, this little boy was everything. He had his mother's fire in him, her spitfire energy, her expressive nature, her way of filling a room just by being in it. He definitely had a flair for the dramatic as well. He made everyone around him laugh, and he was in every way exactly the child you would expect Kristine to have. Deborah fell in love with her grandson immediately, and of course, without reservation, like most grandparents do. And Kristine's siblings stepped proudly into the roles of aunt and uncle. The whole family wrapped themselves around this new little person and claimed him as their very own. And Kristine, she looked at her son and found something she hadn't even known she was looking for: a clarity, a purpose, a reason that made everything make sense. Motherhood changed her in the best way possible. The same kindness she had always freely given to everyone around her was now channeled into something fierce and focused on her son. Her world revolved around Darian. Anyone who spent any time with her during this period could tell immediately it was the way that she would talk about him. And of course, in the way that every decision, she now looked through the lens of what was best for Darian. And it was also in the way that her whole face would change when she described something funny he would do that morning, let's say. Every little thing made her so proud. And I think most parents can relate to that when we have our first child, especially. Every little milestone is important. It's like their first step, obviously, but even like their first giggle, or some people are like, no, they just had gas, but they're like smiling in their sleep. Every little moment is so intense and special.
The relationship between her and Zach, though, was carrying the weight that eventually became too much to hold. After Darren was born, the two of them had tried to make a go of it on their own. They moved out of the Larson-Tilson house and into an apartment, and they attempted to build a family life together, and the reality of it was harder than either of them had been ready for. Sleepless nights, financial strain, the relentless demands of caring for a newborn when you're still in so many ways figuring out who you are yourself. The things that had felt manageable when they were teenagers living in that comfortable safety net of Deborah and Daniel's home became much harder to navigate on their own.
But the relationship began to fray. Arguments became more frequent. The dream of building something together started to feel less like a plan and more like a lot of pressure. And eventually, Kristine made the decision that was the wisest, most loving thing she could do for herself and for Darian. And that was to move back home. It was the right call. It was practical, it was self-aware, and it was made with her son's stability at the center of it. And of course, her family received her back the way they always received everyone, with open arms, no judgment. and a quiet relief that she and Darian were going to be home where they belonged.
Zach stayed involved as Darian's co-parent, and he remained in Darian's life. The two of them settled into a particularly complicated rhythm of sharing a child without sharing a relationship. The pickups, the drop-offs, the coordinating of schedules, the ongoing negotiation of two people who were no longer together, but permanently connected through this little boy that they both loved.
It wasn't simple. It never is. But it was working. After Kristine had moved back home in the summer of 2007, she was finding her footing. She was surrounded by her family. She was pouring herself into Darian and into quietly figuring out the next chapter of her life and what that was going to look like. And she was, for the first time in a while, allowing herself to be more hopeful. So let's jump to close to 6 months later, just weeks before December of 2007. At this point, she started to go out a little more, especially when Zach was taking care of Darian. She was hanging out with one of her best friends, Dolce, and she was actually starting to see different men. There was one in particular. His name was Derek Brown. This was a relationship that was in the new and early stages. She saw it as much more uncomplicated in the way that something is in the very beginning. Her friends noticed the change in her as well. It was the energy of a person who was starting to imagine things getting better in their life.
She felt like she really deserved it, right? She worked hard, she'd shown up for her son, and she put in all that tough, messy effort of rebuilding her life. She deserved to feel good again, and besides that, there was just this everyday rhythm, that plain, ordinary feeling of her days.
Mornings that started early because toddlers don't care what time you get out of bed. Errands, picking up friends, dropping off friends, running to the gas station, doing those very small logistical tasks that we do when our days are busy and full.
Like coordinating with Zach about Darian on pickups, drop-offs, the daily negotiation. And don't forget coming home to her mother's kitchen to the noise of a house that had always felt like safety.
And in December, specifically, it had an additional rhythm. Of course, with the baking that Deborah started early in the month, the decorating, the planning, the way the family kitchen became a production space for the annual cookie exchange. Counters were covered in flour and sugar. And of course, the particular chaos of way too many people trying to help all at once. Kristine in the middle of it all, exactly where she belonged. For days before the 19th, Deborah had been reminding Kristine they really needed to set aside time to make the Merry Christmas. They were running out of days in December. The holiday was getting closer, and Kristine had promised for 3 nights in a row now that she would come home to help. People were counting on them. Their neighbors were counting on this tradition. Their friends were waiting on their candies. So one afternoon on December 19th, when Deborah saw Kristine and her friend Dolce at the house around 1 p.m., she again asked her, and Kristine reassured her, yes, tonight, I will be home to help.
She had a plan, a simple one. She was going to drop off Dolce at the Super America gas station where she worked and then swing by Zach's apartment to pick up Darian, who was now 21 months old.
Wow, that is exactly Mazzie's age right now. So we know what that entails.
And after she got Darian, Kristine would go hang out with her friend Dolce for a bit and be home by about dinner time. She'd be home as she promised. They'd finally get to make the Merry Christmas. Deborah laid out the baking supplies on the counter, started dinner, waited for the sound of her daughter's car in the driveway. But that sound never came.
I know we keep coming back to those ingredients on the counter, and there's a reason for that. The chocolate, the cherries, the almonds, and all those small pieces of a tradition that Kristine and her mother had been building together for years. And that's because of what December 19th, 2007 was supposed to be. An evening in a warm Minnesota home with holiday music playing and the smell of something cooking on the stove. A mother and her daughter side by side in the kitchen, making their Merry Christmas the way they always did.
Instead, those ingredients would sit untouched on that counter for months. Deborah would not be able to move them. Every time she'd walk into that kitchen, they were there. A reminder of a wound that wouldn't close.
But we're not there yet. That evening stretched on. The light outside went flat and gray, the way it always does in December in Minnesota. The darkness coming earlier than you ever quite get used to. The house stayed warm, the baking supplies stayed on the counter, and dinner was ready now. But Kristine still wasn't home.
Deborah wasn't alarmed yet. Not really. Kristine was 19. Things ran late. Maybe Darren had needed something before they could leave. Maybe she had run into someone. Maybe the east side traffic had been slow. There were hundreds of small explanations, and Deborah cycled through all of them the way mothers do. She wasn't panicked. She was just filling the silence with reasonable possibilities. She reached for the phone to call her daughter and then remembered, with a fresh wave of frustration, that Kristine had loaned her cell phone to her friend Brandy. There was no way to reach her directly. So Deborah waited a little longer, cleaned up the kitchen, glanced at the window, listened for that sound of the car in the driveway.
Every time she thought she heard one, her heart lifted just a little, and every time it wasn't Kristine. And the evening kept moving, and Kristine did not come home. No call, no knock at the door, nothing. And the absence of any word from her was the part that sat wrong with Deborah, because Kristine was good about checking in. She wasn't the kind of person who went quiet without an explanation. She was the person who called just to tell you, I'm running 5 minutes late. She was the person who sent a quick text just to let you know she hadn't forgotten. The silence wasn't like her, but she didn't have her phone. So maybe once she had a chance in the busyness, she would reach out.
But what do you do when you have the feeling that you can't reach someone and the explanations are still technically possible? You wait a little longer, right? You tell yourself you're overreacting. You remind yourself that she is an adult and adults can run late, and they do. And, there's probably a completely ordinary reason for all this, right? But by 10 o'clock, after hours of waiting and watching and talking herself down, Deborah gave up. She gave up on the evening. She and Daniel turned off the kitchen light. The baking supplies stayed where they were on the kitchen counter, untouched, and they made their way to the bedroom and got ready for bed. They turned on the evening news, and it was a low, familiar sound, and the sound filling the room the way it did every night.
And then a news report stopped them both. A reporter describing a car fire in Minneapolis with the body of a teenage girl found inside. Deborah and Daniel paused. They looked at the screen, the way that you would look at something terrible that's happening to someone else, someone on the other side of the city from your quiet home in St. Paul Park. Daniel shook his head. His voice was quiet and heavy with sympathy that you feel for a stranger that you will never meet. He said, "It sucks to be that family." They turned off the television and they went to bed, not knowing they were that family. And I can't even begin to imagine.
Let's rewind and travel to another neighborhood out in Minneapolis, a historic district, a suburban area called Seward, with lots of Victorian-style homes mixed with modern ones, and between those homes were alleyways. It was the glow that caught the driver's attention first. A woman was on her way home when she was about to pull into that alley off of the 2200 block of 24th Avenue South. She noticed a strange car parked right near her house in the alley where she usually pulled in and parked. But what stood out were the flames. She got out of the car, and the smell was overpowering. There was smoke billowing out. She ran inside her home to alert her husband. She quickly dialed 911. It was around 8 p.m. He told dispatch there was a car on fire behind their house in the alley, and he'd go and check it out with his fire extinguisher. He hung up and ran to the car in the freezing darkness.
When he pulled the car door open and aimed the extinguisher at the flames, what he found stopped him completely. In the back seat was a young woman, motionless, pale in the dim light, her limbs stiff against the cold, and he pulled her out, desperate, hoping that he was early enough. But he knew she was already gone. It was too late. He ran back inside and called 911 for a second time. This time the man explained there was a dead person found inside of the car in his alley. Minneapolis police arrived within minutes. The alley was quickly cordoned off, crime scene tape strung across both ends. Officers and fire personnel surrounded the charred vehicle, while residents from the neighboring houses began to appear at the ends of their driveways, bundled up in the cold, whispering to one another in the dark. The case was handed to Sergeant Rick Zimmerman, a 12-year veteran on the police department homicide division, and his partner, Sergeant Tammy Diedrich, both seasoned investigators. And why I got so interested in this case to begin with is because of the show First 48. Many of you know it's a true crime show where they follow investigators in the first 48 hours after a crime occurred. And this particular police department was being followed by cameras at the time that this murder occurred. So there was so much documented from all of these moments, from the time they arrived to the entire investigation. And getting that insight and seeing it playing out in almost like real time, because it was in the moment, really hit me in a way that's different, because I'm not just reading about a case in a legal document or possibly watching one of those shows that reenact all of those moments, but they never seem to get it right. This was different. We saw everything so that we could relay it to you and even share some of it with you.
Sergeant Chris Gators was also called out that night. We mentioned him in the beginning, right? He was the one at home with his family carefully stringing the lights on the Christmas tree when his phone rang. His children's excitement filling the room right up until the moment he had to tell them that he was leaving and that he didn't know when he'd be back. It could be days.
Yeah, can you imagine that during the holidays? I mean, cops know that they're going to have to be pulled away, but I've heard that so many times, like they're in the middle of something, living their life, and that's what they signed up for. Gotta go.
When Zimmerman and Diedrich stepped out into that alley, the smell of smoke was hanging heavy in the frozen air. The white Buick was badly charred inside, but not consumed by the fire. The exterior looked almost untouched. The burn had been uneven, amateurish, and the kind of fire that speaks more to the panic than to planning. Someone had wanted to destroy something in here. They hadn't succeeded. That neighbor with a fire extinguisher and a 911 call had seen to that.
The young woman had been pulled from the back seat by the man who found her, and she had been slumped over in the back seat, clearly deceased. She appeared she had been dead for some time. Zimmerman moved carefully through the scene, taking everything in. The first detail that stood out to him before anything else, before he had processed the full picture about what happened to this woman, was what she wasn't wearing. No winter coat, no shoes, and no socks. Just a pair of jeans, a white shirt, and a thin jacket, which were pulled up all the way to her neck, exposing her chest and midsection. On a Minnesota night in December, where the temperature had long dropped below zero and the ground was frozen, there was this young woman in a burning car with bare feet on one of the coldest nights of the year. That's how he knew she was brought there against her will.
Whatever had happened to her hadn't happened in the alley. This was the dump site. Someone had put her here after the fact and set the car on fire, hoping the flames would take care of the rest. And clearly they hadn't. What the fire left behind told investigators everything they needed to know. The backseat was messy, there was all kinds of papers scattered around, clothing, and a charred car seat, which was pretty haunting to see. There was just this white film of ash all over everything in the front, in the back, everywhere. It was just covered in ash.
There was more damage to the passenger's backseat and the backseat area itself. It looked like the fire was concentrated in that area. Sergeant Diedrich noticed an ash-covered purse sitting inside that car seat. A gloved officer pulled it out, and they were able to open it up, and that's when they see a wallet inside. So they open it. They don't see a license at first, but they do see a bank card. And when they look at the name, it says Kristine C. Larson. One of the death investigators kneeled down and saw that there was an abrasion on her left hand. It looked like a defensive wound. But what stuck out the most was her neck. Pressed deep into her skin were ligature marks. A length of white cord was still looped around several times, and her eyes had petechiae. These are tiny hemorrhages in the blood vessels, the kind that appear when someone is strangled. A sustained, deliberate force applied to their neck. Zimmerman had seen it before. He knew exactly what it meant. She had been forcefully choked. And it actually broke my heart to see a picture of Kristine and Darian that they pulled from that same purse, something she carried with her. A young woman smiling, and that same young woman holding a toddler close to her. Her whole face lit up with this particular joy of someone holding the thing they love the most in the world. Zimmerman looked at that photograph, and then he looked at that car seat.
Where was her son? Thankfully, they looked there and there was no baby in that vehicle. But where was he?
Now that they had this picture, a name, and a crime scene, soon after they found her driver's license. And when they saw she was only 19 and they knew she was a mother, Detective Diedrich was stunned. She said, "She's so beautiful. She's a very pretty girl." And that's when they focused on the baby. A child's car seat in the back of a murder victim's car meant a child who needed to be accounted for immediately. It was below zero. If this little boy was somewhere out there alone or worse, every minute mattered. The urgency that had already been driving the scene doubled at this point, and investigators worked faster. Every available resource was focused on finding out where Kristine's child was and whether he was safe. They called dispatch to alert officers in the area in case there were any reports of a toddler being found or one reported missing.
Also found in the backseat was a partially burned phone book. The yellow pages again.
What are the chances? We just talked about the yellow pages in one of our last videos.
But its edges charred and curling, clearly used as kindling to try to get the fire going. No accelerant had been used, no gasoline, no lighter fluid, just the phone book and a little bit of desperation. It was, investigators noted, a clumsy attempt. The act of someone who needed to destroy evidence quickly and didn't have a plan for how to do it.
Yeah, and they wondered if the phone book had come from a certain neighborhood because if you recall from back in the day, the way they're designed, they are designated to certain areas. They're placed on doorsteps. And this one was marked St. Paul Park, 30 minutes away. Now they had 2 neighborhoods to canvass for answers, starting with this one where the car had been found. Kristine's remains were placed in a body bag and gently carried away into the coroner's van to be transported to the medical examiner's office to complete a full autopsy. And meanwhile, investigators went door to door in the bitter cold.
Neighbors confirmed the car had not been in the alley earlier that evening. One resident had left their house around 6:30 and the alley had been empty. Another said they drove by at 7:30 and the car wasn't there. But by 8 o'clock, it was there and already on fire. So that window from 7:30 to 8 became the first critical piece of timeline that investigators were only just beginning to build. But Diedrich and Zimmerman have to notify Kristine's parents. It's not a task they look forward to. I mean, who would want to do that? But they have an address on the driver's license, so they head out to St. Paul Park.
In the early hours of the morning, around 3 o'clock a.m., a sharp knock rattled the quiet of the Larson-Tilson household. Daniel went to the door first, pulled from his sleep, drowsy and confused, and Deborah was right behind him. On the porch were detectives. And when Daniel opened the door, Sergeant Diedrich introduced herself and said, "There's been an incident in Minneapolis about 8 o'clock tonight. And it looks right now that Kristine has passed away." Now, I really don't want to show you this footage because I don't think it's necessary, but we will show you some screenshots. Deborah's first words were, "I want to see her face one more time again." And then she just kept saying, "Oh no, oh no, oh no." And Sergeant Diedrich sat down with her and Deborah put her hands over her face and cried. Her legs were shaking. She just lost her youngest child.
And then the sound that came out of her was not like anything Daniel had ever heard before. He tried to hold her, tried to steady her, but he was reeling himself, trying to process what the officers were telling him while his wife was in tears. It hit him that just hours earlier, the two of them had been lying in bed watching the evening news, when that reporter described a car fire in Minneapolis. Remember, they heard that the body of a teenage girl was found inside. Daniel had sympathy for that teenager's loved ones, saying, "It sucks to be that family." Now impossibly standing in his own home at 3 a.m. with detectives on his porch, he understood that he had been talking about his own.
And through the shock and the sheer impossibility of what was unfolding, one question cut through everything else for Deborah. She asked, "Where's Darian?" The detectives wanted to know as well. They had found that car seat. They had a photograph of Kristine holding a little boy. They'd been asking that question since they first processed the scene. And they asked Deborah gently but urgently, did she know where her grandson was? Deborah said he must be with his father. She had called Zach when she could not reach Kristine earlier, and he didn't hear from her either. He'd been waiting for her to come not only pick up Darian, but him as well. At 2:30, they had planned to go Christmas shopping with Darian together, but she never showed up.
Deborah said she'd been in contact with Zach all day. They were back and forth asking if the other had heard from Kristine yet, and they were both concerned. This whole plan was important for them, especially for Kristine. They were going to the charity drive for underprivileged children, and Zach thought it was really odd that she would miss that. The detectives asked Deborah for the father's name, and she said Zachary Otis Matthews. Then they asked if she should call Zach and make sure Darian is there. Deborah's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. Her mind was trying to hold two unbearable things at the same time. The loss of her daughter, and possibly that her grandson might also be in danger somewhere out in that December cold. So she dialed Zach's number, he answered, and she asked him right away if Darian was with him. And he said, yes, he's here, he's asleep.
The relief of that single fact washed over her. Her grandson was okay, he was warm, he was safe, he was with his father. For one brief moment in the middle of the worst night of her life, she could breathe again. But now she had to break the news to her grandson's father that Kristine was gone. She said, I'm so sorry, Zach. Kristine is dead. That's why she wasn't answering our calls. And in that moment, Zach's composure broke. He sobbed on the other end of that line. His voice was shaking. He was barely able to get words out. He kept asking, why? What happened? And Deborah told him Kristine had been murdered. And that seemed to cause Zach more heartbreak. He yelled, who could do this? Who could possibly do something like this to her? And then he spiraled. He asked how he was supposed to raise their son without her. What was he supposed to do now? Deborah, even in the wreckage of her own grief, told him to bring Darian and come stay with their family. She needed her grandson close. She needed to hold him. And Zach, he was like a son to her. They had been very close. She told him, just come. And he said he would.
While Deborah and Daniel were trying to hold each other together in that St. Paul Park living room, Zimmerman and Diedrich still had a lot of work to do. They asked Deborah about Kristine's close friends, and she tells them about Dolce. She was Kristine's best friend, but she already called her, and she hadn't heard from her either. Dolce said she saw Kristine last when she dropped her off at the gas station, but after that, it was just silence. And right away, Deborah alerted the detectives that she's not really fond of Dolce. She feels like she's trouble, and she always feels like she knows more than she's telling her.
And if that's the last time someone saw her, since she never showed up at Zach's, could Dolce know something?
Right, so they needed to track her down as soon as possible because maybe she knew something that Kristine's mother didn't.
Exactly, because friends confide in one another, especially young women. They don't want their moms to know certain things.
That's right.
And that alley wasn't giving up its secrets easily, but it was giving up enough for investigators to comb through every inch of that vehicle and bag and tag and photograph and document every detail, because every detail mattered. Every detail was a potential thread that pulled in the right direction might lead somewhere. And the autopsy confirmed what detectives had already suspected at the scene. Her cause of death? Ligature strangulation. The ligature around Kristine's neck was carefully documented and preserved. A length of white cord. It was thin and still looped around her neck. The medical examiner will look at it more closely. But even at the scene, investigators could see it was consistent with something thin, something that could be tied, something that might not immediately stand out as a weapon if maybe you saw it sitting somewhere ordinary. A shoelace. And the hemorrhages in her eyes confirmed what the ligature marks already suggested. Her airway was cut off long enough to cause her death.
This hadn't happened quickly, not accidentally, but with sustained and deliberate force. The kind that takes time. The kind that requires someone to make a choice and keep making it for at least 3 to 5 minutes.
While their victim is struggling.
However, there was also injuries to her head. A blunt force wound, the kind that comes from impact, whether from an object or from a surface, maybe a wall, a floor, maybe a piece of furniture. That couldn't be determined with certainty at this stage, but the wound suggested that she may have been struck or slammed before strangulation.
That she may have been incapacitated first.
Right, that whoever did this wanted to make sure she could not get away.
She had been fully dressed. There were no signs of the kind of assault that investigators sometimes see in cases like this. It didn't seem like a sexually motivated murder. The fire had caused some burns to her clothing and to her skin, and there were patches of damage where the flames had reached before the neighbor extinguished them. But the fire had not been the cause of her death and had not consumed enough of the evidence to obscure what had happened. If anything, the way that this person carried it out like an amateur and their attempt to burn the car had actually preserved it more than it destroyed it. But at this stage, investigators had what they needed to understand the basics of how Kristine had died. Now the question was where and who. Where Kristine was left told them something about the person who left her there. The choice of this larger city, a higher crime rate, a place where a body burning in a car might attract less focused attention than it would maybe in a smaller community. It suggested that someone was thinking, at least a little bit, about how to obscure what they had done. But the execution of that plan, not so thought out. Not in a strategy for getting away from the scene. It suggested someone was improvising. Someone had done something, and then they were scrambling to cover it up without knowing how. As they say, it's not the crime that gives you away. It's the cover-up.
That combination of deliberate thought mixed with obvious panic told investigators that they were probably not looking for someone with experience. They were looking for someone full of rage, someone who was mad, jealous, or maybe even hated Kristine.
And who had access to her, who knew her well enough to have been somewhere with her that afternoon without raising any alarms. Kristine almost certainly knew this person who did this. Remember, she had been somewhere without her coat on and with no shoes on. She had been somewhere she felt safe because you don't take off your shoes somewhere that you feel afraid. You do not set down your coat somewhere that you're not comfortable. So she was at ease right up until she wasn't.
Zimmerman and Dietrich started where homicide detectives always start, with the people closest to the victim. It's not a cynical instinct, it's a statistical one. The overwhelming majority of violent crimes committed against women are committed by someone they know, someone they trusted, someone who had access to them in the ordinary course of their daily life. So before you chase anything else, before you follow another thread, you start there. You build a picture of who this person was, who was in her world, and you work outward from the center. Her family, her friends, her son's father, someone new in her life. Detectives needed to talk to all of them. They already spoke to Deborah. Detectives listened to it all and wrote everything down. 3 names had already risen to the surface before they had spoke to a single other person. Her best friend Dolce, her ex Zachary Matthews, and the new guy, Derek Brown.
But first, they pulled surveillance footage from the Super America gas station on Kristine's route. Because remember, cameras don't lie. Did she really drop off Dolce that morning? The grainy footage showed her car pulling into the lot. Kristine and another female are casually walking inside, and it's Dolce. Kristine had on a pair of jeans, a white shirt, a black vest, and a black thin jacket, which matched what she was found in. And if you're already wondering what about her coat, well, this was during the day. It's warmer. Her coat would have possibly been in the car. She wouldn't have needed it until later. Kristine goes to the counter. She's buying a few small items. The clerk behind the register would tell the investigators later that she had been laughing and joking, and nothing about her suggested that she was fearful or had any kind of anxiety or awareness that something was wrong. She was just a young woman running an errand on a Wednesday afternoon, completely at ease, completely herself. And she leaves without her friend Dolce.
Then the camera caught her heading back out to the car at 2:15 in the afternoon. No one appeared to follow her out. No one was waiting for her in the lot. She pulled out of Super America and drove away. And that was the last time any camera captured Kristine Larson alive. She made a left as she exited, which was toward St. Paul. That timestamp of 2:15 p.m. became the first firm anchor in a timeline that investigators were working to build from the ground up. So they decide to speak to Dolce now that they've confirmed that she was with her that day.
Detectives actually take a ride out to Dolce's house. They pick her up and they give her a ride to the police station because she doesn't have a car of her own, hence why she relied on Kristine for a ride. She could not believe that her friend was dead. She was still trying to process all of it on the ride to the station. However, she was also a mess because of Deborah, Kristine's mom. She'd apparently called Dolce, yelling at her, screaming about how Dolce's always out with Kristine, and she was almost blaming Dolce for what happened to her daughter. Deborah wanted to know why her daughter seemed distant lately. Why was she staying out longer, not opening up to her, especially within the last several days? She flat out said to Dolce, "You know something. You know what happened. Tell me." But Dolce swears she doesn't know anything.
So Sergeant Dietrich sits down with Dolce and asks her to describe the morning before. She was very emotional. She explained that morning, Kristine came to pick her up, and Dolce had actually set Kristine up with an interview at the gas station where she worked. So the first thing in the morning, they dropped by there, and her manager sat down with her. Afterward, they went back and hung out at Kristine's until about 1:30. Everything was pretty ordinary. She confirmed that Kristine's plan for the afternoon was to drop off Dolce and then go pick up Darian and then go to Toys for Tots, then come home. No other stops, no detour, no other plans to see anyone else. But Sergeant Dietrich asked her point blank, why didn't she make it to Zach's?
And Dolce was like, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because she's telling them that she talked to Zach right before she dropped Dolce off. She was telling Zach, I'm on my way there. So Sergeant Dietrich was like, okay, listen, we're not trying to point fingers at anyone. We're just trying to understand Kristine's relationships and her life. So can you tell us anything specific about her and Zach? And she said that in the beginning, things were good with Zach. But after the baby came, it seemed like he wasn't ready for a commitment. He wanted to go out with his friends, and he was 21. Kristine was only 19. So there he was going to bars and clubs, and she couldn't get in. And that started to bother her. He would get texts from people that she didn't know. And Kristine thought that these women were probably women he was cheating on her with. She caught him flirting with other girls, even found pictures of other women in his phone. And she had enough. There were even times when they were living together that Zach would leave her with Darian and go out without making any plans with her, and he would just leave. That's why she decided to break up with him and move back in with her parents 6 months ago.
Soon after, Dolce noticed Zach bringing Kristine flowers, as if trying to step up more as a dad, which was different than what Deborah had seen in the past. She felt like both of them were moving on, but Dolce said she didn't think Zach really was. He would tell Kristine all the time that he missed her and loved her.
Then Dolce also told them something that stopped investigators cold. Kristine had confided in her about Zach, about the relationship and what had sometimes looked like behind closed doors. Dolce told detectives that Kristine had told her that Zach hit her, not pushed her, hit her hard, harder than she had ever been hit by anyone before. And that is definitely not a good sign.
Dolce said that's not all. She described an incident involving Deborah. Deborah had noticed holes in the apartment walls literally when she came to visit. And then there was an altercation in which Zach had allegedly choked Deborah.
Yes, Kristine's own mother, the woman who had taken him in.
Who had given him a home. And then there was this. Zach wasn't over Kristine. He still wanted to be at least physically with her, to cuddle when she would come get Darian or to be close, but Kristine didn't want that, and she made it clear. He wasn't going to get to sleep with her and be intimate with her when they're not together, and she had a new boyfriend.
Zach knew about Derek, and according to Dolce, he was not handling it well. He actually jumped out of Kristine's car and launched himself over the other side of a railing on a bridge in St. Paul and told her he was going to jump right into the Mississippi River. He screamed at her. He said, "Say you're going to leave me." And Kristine called the police. They were able to talk him off the ledge, but she held firm. She wasn't getting back with him. But all this was months and months ago. Since then, he worked on himself a lot. He had gotten a job. He went to college. He was bettering himself. But part of that, friend said, was hopefully to show Kristine he was good enough for her, so she would take him back. But it didn't change her mind. She said her feelings were not there anymore. When Sergeant Dietrich asked Dolce directly, if you were in our shoes, who would you look at? Her answer came without a moment of hesitation. She said, truthfully, I would look toward Zach. Because if Kristine were going anywhere else or doing anything with anyone else, she would have told Dolce.
So detectives do a background check on Zachary Matthews, and sure enough, he's got domestics on his record. 2 reported from Kristine and 1 from Deborah. So that matches exactly with what Dolce told them. He becomes a person of interest in the case. They pull up his MySpace page. That's right, his MySpace page. That was social media's choice back in that day.
Yeah, because Facebook had just started in, I think, 2007. And remember, it was only colleges. You had to have a college email address to create a Facebook account.
And on this MySpace page, there were a few emotional posts about how now he guesses he's single, little rants here and there about how tough it is being a single dad, and other posts were normal for a young man his age. But the address they have on file isn't current, so they wonder if Deborah would possibly know how to get in touch with Zach. And remember, she asked him to please come over with the baby on Thursday after they heard the horrible news.
It was now Sunday, and Detective Graders and Zimmerman reach out to Deborah, and she tells him that Zach is still with her and the family. He's at their house. They're grieving with them. He was a wreck when he got there. He was falling down on the floor crying, and he just fell into Deborah's arms and sobbed and wept. And they were actually trying to comfort him, and he was doing the same for all of them. Zimmerman was actually surprised that Deborah would allow Zach over there after what he read in that report regarding the altercation. But his reasoning was that Deborah had just lost her daughter. She wanted her grandson close, so she was going to set aside any issues she might have with Zach. And Zach didn't have a car, so Deborah agreed to drive him over to the police station. He was introduced to Detective Zimmerman and Dietrich, and Gators was watching from a monitor across the hall.
Zach did not come in looking like a man with something to hide. He came in looking like a grieving father who had just lost the mother of his child. He was emotional, he was cooperative, and he answered their questions, and his story was straightforward. It matched what both Dolce and Deborah had said. Kristine was supposed to come by at 2, but she never showed up. He couldn't call her because Brandy borrowed her phone, which he wasn't happy about, but she said it was better that way because she really didn't want him calling her all the time, and that felt like an insult. Like maybe she was with another guy and didn't want the ex interrupting. But what bothered him was that Kristine would ignore his calls, which is why he kept calling her. So he waited, and when she didn't come over, he took Darian onto the city bus instead, just the two of them, father and son, heading to the toy drive without her. He arrived around 3, stayed for a short while, and was back home by about 6:30 in the evening.
When asked about the fighting between them, he described the breakup the way that someone describes something painful that they've made peace with. He said he missed her and that it had been hard, but he claimed he accepted it. As long as he could be in his son's life, that's all that mattered. And seeing Kristine happy was enough for him. He explained that the only reason they argued was over Kristine not wanting to be with him anymore and her being with another man. But Dietrich was like, well, we talked to other people, and they said Kristine told them you beat her. He calmly pushed back. He said, no, I was beaten as a child. I don't beat women. And no, the most I'd ever done is push her, and I'll admit to that. He also owned up to the situation with Kristine's mother, but he said it wasn't choking. It was him pushing her away because she was trying to grab at him. And in anger, he said he put his forearm up and it ended up across her throat so that he could defend himself in that moment.
Zimmerman watched him carefully as he talked. He noticed the composure, the way Zach moved through the interview was without visible breaks in his demeanor. He had enough experience to know what grief looks like and how it looks different on different people, that numbness and calm are not automatically suspicious, and that some people go quiet when they're devastated rather than maybe falling apart. He did not read too much into his demeanor because, as they say, everyone grieves differently.
And yet the history that Dolce had described, the violence, the possessiveness, his awareness of Derek, and then the way his calm had flickered just for a moment, just barely, when Dietrich mentioned that investigators would be pulling up his phone records. Her words were, if we check your phone, it will bounce right at your house, right? And he's like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, we've got secret ways to do stuff. He's like, to check where I was at? And she's like, yeah. There was a pause before he said, yeah, it should.
It was a small thing, a subtle thing, the kind of thing that a less experienced detective might not have caught or might have dismissed, but Zimmerman caught it, and he filed it away. That pause felt like fear, but he couldn't be sure. I mean, it is a very stressful situation.
Exactly, but to verify Zach's account, detectives moved quickly. They spoke to Kristine's stepdad, who said, yeah, Zach had been calling the house throughout the entire day and evening and into the night. He was in constant contact with Deborah. He even sent Deborah a picture of Darian on the bus that afternoon, bundled up in his winter hat and his little face peering out from all the layers of his coat and scarf. So after confirming that Zach had been in contact with Deborah pretty much all evening, and from his interview, they believed that he could be cleared and he was allowed to leave. Now, they were still going to request his cell data, but they wanted to speak to Brandy next.
Brandy was also at the Larson-Tilson household where everyone had gathered to support one another. She said she'd known Kristine since 7th grade, and when asked about how Brandy thought Kristine felt about Zach, she said she really didn't think Kristine liked him that much. But then she dropped a bombshell. She's like, well, yeah, I know Kristine is really into Derek. She's been seeing him for about 3 weeks, but the thing is, Derek lives with his girlfriend and 3 kids.
What?
Yeah, and Zimmerman said the same thing. He's like, what? He's got a girlfriend?
Did Kristine know that?
Well, Brandy said she did, but Derek had lied to her and said that they broke up, but they hadn't. And Brandy also said that Derek had told people that he saw Kristine on Wednesday, that same day she was killed. He made it sound like he just kind of ran into her while she was out running errands. It seemed a little odd to the detectives, and so they do a quick background check. And he had been arrested in the past, but not for any assaults or domestic issues. However, because he was seeing Kristine, he became a person of interest as well, and they requested his cell records too. When they reached out to speak with Derek, they found out not only did he not show up for work, but he kind of disappeared. No one knew where he was, and that didn't look good. Could he have been upset that Kristine was planning on hanging out with her ex that afternoon?
First of all, it's like they always say, "Oh, I'm broken up. Like I'm not with this person anymore." It's like a common thing when they're cheating. But they do track him down, and when detectives finally sit across from Derek Brown, what they found out was not the behavior of someone trying to escape justice. What they found was a man who was completely destroyed. He was crying openly. He talked about Kristine in a way that was raw and unguarded. He called her amazing. He called her beautiful. He said she was like an angel who had fallen from the sky. A little cheesy, but he explained that he hadn't gone into hiding. He wasn't running from investigators, but because he was so overwhelmed by grief, he didn't know what to do. He loved her. He said that even though they'd only been together a short time, he genuinely loved her.
He also told investigators something important. He had seen Kristine that afternoon, December 19th. He'd been driving and recognized her car on the road. He knew it by the baseball cap she always kept in the back window, so he pulls up alongside her at the stoplight and waves. She rolls down her window, they exchange a few words, and she told him she was on her way to pick up her son and that she would call him later. Then the light changed, they went their separate ways, and Derek went to get Chinese food and then spent the rest of the evening at his brother's house waiting for Kristine to call, and that call never came.
At that point, detectives collected his cell phone and submitted it for a tower search covering the critical window of that afternoon and evening. They needed to know where his phone had been pinging during those hours. They needed to know if his account held up. It only took about a day, and the tower data showed Derek's phone had been pinging right near his brother's house in St. Paul Park. Throughout the entire evening, he was nowhere near where Kristine's body had been found. His account, as far as the cell tower data was concerned, held up. So Derek was not their guy.
However, with him eliminated, detectives found themselves back where they started, back at the center of Kristine's world, back to the name that kept coming up no matter which direction they turned: Zachary Matthews. His cell phone began heading toward Minneapolis around 6:30 p.m. and hit off a tower just 3 turnouts from where her body was found.
Wow. So his alibi hadn't checked out. It did on the surface, but there were gaps. There were inconsistencies. There was that flicker of something in his composure when the phone records were even mentioned. And then there was everything that Dolce had told them: the violence, the jealousy, the knowledge of Derek, the history of a man who did not handle losing control of a situation particularly well. Zimmerman and Dietrich were not done with Zach, not even close. They had enough probable cause to ask a judge to issue a search warrant for Zach's apartment. But they had to make sure he stayed away. So they called Deborah and they told her to make it seem as though it would be dangerous for him and the baby to leave until detectives had more information about who hurt Kristine. She wasn't given any reasons, so she might have really thought it was true.
Meanwhile, Zimmerman and Dietrich kept coming back to the timeline, not because it was the most dramatic piece of what they had, but because timelines don't lie. People do. Alibis get coached and stories get rehearsed, and emotions can be performed on an audience. But a timeline is a hard, factual sequence of where and when someone was. It's either consistent or it isn't. And the more investigators pulled at Zach's timeline, the more it started to feel like a sweater with a loose thread. One tug in the right place, and the whole thing starts to unravel. So they went back to his phone records.
Zach, by all accounts, was someone who was constantly on his phone. Not occasionally, not when he had a reason to be, constantly, whether it was calling someone, texting, email, social media, the kind of continuous digital activity that most of us and people his age would be doing without even thinking about it. When investigators pulled his records and laid them out chronologically, the pattern was immediately obvious. Page after page of activity, barely a gap anywhere. The phone was almost always in use, almost always pinging it somewhere, almost always leaving a trace of where he was and what he was doing. Almost always.
Except on this afternoon of December 19th, there was a gap.
Not a small one. Not the kind of pause that happens when someone sets their phone down to eat lunch or steps into a meeting.
An hour and 5 minutes of near silence. Sitting in the middle of an otherwise unbroken stream of activity, like a hole cut clean through the record.
The last text before the gap was sent at 12:47 in the afternoon, and then nothing. Then, after 2 in that afternoon, a sudden rush of activity again. Calls, texts, messages, all coming in quick succession, as though someone had picked up the phone and was trying to make up for lost time.
Investigators examined that gap and then reviewed their timeline. Kristine had last been seen on camera at 2:15, leaving the Super America gas station. She had told Dolce that she was heading straight to Zach's apartment. That alley where her body was found had been empty as late as 6:30 in the evening. The gap in Zach's phone activity sat right in the window when investigators believed Kristine had arrived at his apartment.
That gap was not nothing. That gap was everything. Zach's phone had been pinging in his apartment in St. Paul that afternoon, then near the area of the toy drive consistent with his account of taking Darian on the bus, and then back to his apartment. So far, nothing had contradicted his story. And then his phone began moving westbound along Interstate 94, the direct route from St. Paul into Minneapolis. During the exact window, the narrow critical window between 6:30 and 8 in the evening, when Kristine's body was being left in that alley and her car was being set on fire. Zach's phone was on that highway, moving in the direction of that area. At the same time, investigators believe Kristine was being left there. And then it moved back, east again, towards St. Paul, back towards his home.
But phone records alone were not enough. Zimmerman knew that. A gap in activity proved that Zachary had put his phone down. It didn't prove what he had done while it was down. He needed more. He needed something that put Zach not just in the right window of time, but in the right place. Investigators looked through reports from that night and noted one tip that came in about a man matching Zach's description who had been seen walking eastbound along Interstate 94 towards St. Paul on the night of the murder, right in the window when Kristine's car was being set on fire in that Minneapolis alley. Just walking, moving east towards St. Paul. It wasn't proof, but it was another thread.
So they do get that search warrant, and what they found inside began to build a picture that was impossible to look away from. In his living room, sitting in plain sight, in an open drawer, was a stack of St. Paul Park phone books, identical in every meaningful way to the partially burned phone book that investigators had recovered from the back seat of Kristine's car, the one that had been used as kindling in that clumsy, desperate attempt to set that vehicle on fire. The same edition, the one that got dropped on that doorstep in that suburban community, and it sat in that living room for months without anyone thinking twice about it.
And then investigators found letters. They were in a hallway closet, a collection of them, some pages long, written by Zach addressed to Kristine, but apparently never given to her. And what was in those letters was a revelation, not because it was surprising exactly, but because of how completely it contradicted the version of himself he'd presented to the investigators. In the interview room, he had been calm, he'd been measured, and he had talked about the breakup like someone who'd processed it and then moved forward. He said that as long as he could be in his son's life and seeing Kristine happy, that was enough. He presented himself as someone who was at peace with how things had turned out. But the letters said something different entirely. They swung from extremes, from desperate, obsessive declarations of love to bitter, accusatory passages that seethed with resentment. He wrote that his world had been completely shattered. He wrote about doing everything in his power to win Kristine back. And he wrote about the ways that he felt that she had wronged him in a tone that was dark and volatile and nothing like the composed, resigned man who had sat across from Zimmerman and answered questions with steady eyes.
He had not moved on. He had not made peace with anything. He was still consumed by Kristine and by losing her and by the fear of losing her further, by the knowledge that she was building a life that did not include him anymore. And now there was someone else, Derek. A detail that had not appeared in the letters, but that investigators knew had been sitting in Zach's awareness. Like a splinter, it was something small and unreachable, but getting worse every day. You can pause and read these letters, but I felt like they should be read out loud as well. 2 of them were poems. They even rhymed. The first one was entitled, "You Looked Fabulous." It read, "You looked fabulous tonight, but that's to be expected. You want to be a part, but I just can't accept it. But now I'm seeing life in a different perspective. The light is shining through a brand new spectrum. So I need you to answer a few questions. If I show you the most respect over time, with a promise to never neglect over the whole time, you know my question, would you accept or reject? There's nothing I can say to erase the pain. Apologizing over and over again. I can't erase the numbers. I can't take back the stupid mistakes. But baby, just stay around and I'll make it up in every way. I promise I'll make you smile and listen to every word you have to say. And then there was more of what I would refer to as a mean letter. I mean, it was a venting, if you will. Now, this one was all about how she has so many excuses and how she's been lying to him, and she justifies it in her head. It's your cop-out because you weren't woman enough to say you didn't want to be with me. You were trying to find faults so that you could compare me to other guys. I now realize that you felt guilty about being with me because you were cheating, which is why you never had my pictures on your MySpace or your personal phone, which is why you were so secretive about MySpace. It makes me feel worse now that I've put two and two together. I hate the fact that I miss you so much, but you don't give a damn about me. I hate the fact I always get effed when I care about people, and you're just a new name on a list. I hate that you said I wasn't a good daddy, and you were going to find a new one for D. I hate that for the last few months, I've only been an ignorant bleep. You and your family, and even your friends, I guess I was ignorant for trying to love you, and ignorant for trying to be a better dad than I had. Yes, I know I effed up in our past. And even when I'm dead, you are still going to use it against me. After you said that you can't dwell on the past and what happened, you need to focus on the future. And I hope you realize how hypocritical that is. I don't want to keep writing because I feel like I'm dead already. You aren't in my life. Darian isn't in my life. And you are out with some bleep. Just know, if you're reading this, it's already too late for me. This letter means that you were out having fun while I was dying. This means you ignored me all weekend because of a situation I couldn't control. I do want to say thanks for not believing in me in the worst part of my life. I hope you have fun with this new guy. I'll always love you, which is why you'll find me in the Mississippi. So that is a lot. It is. But I don't know. It really does sound depressing, but breakups hurt. However, it wasn't just the letters.
I mean, to each their own, right? How some artists, poets, writers will jot down thoughts in disarray, and it feels cathartic, right? Because it truly does help to release that energy. Forensic investigators moved through the apartment carefully, methodically. Looking at everything on the mattress in the bedroom, they saw what appeared to be tiny droplets of blood, and also a smear on a wooden post between the kitchen and the living room. To confirm, they used luminol, a chemical that reacts to the presence of blood, even after the surface had been cleaned, even after time has passed, even after someone has diligently scrubbed at something they needed to see disappear. Under the luminol, the apartment told a different story than the one that Zach had presented. The wooden post lit up with blood traces that were consistent with impact, consistent with the head being slammed against it with force.
A heavy glass vase sitting nearby also tested positive for blood. It had been cleaned thoroughly, carefully. The kind of cleaning that goes beyond what you would do when something gets dirty by accident. The kind of cleaning that happens when someone needs something to be really clean because they're hiding something. But luminol does not care how carefully you clean something or how much it has been scrubbed. It finds what was there regardless. Blood on the mattress and the bedding too. Traces of it, soaked in and dried, telling the story of something that had happened in that bedroom. And then Detective Gators found the shoes.
Amongst Zach's belongings, his clothing, personal items, the ordinary accumulated stuff of a young man's apartment, there was a collection of shoes. Gators went through them carefully, and on one pair he found something that was not there. A shoelace. There was a missing shoelace. One shoe, one lace gone, not worn down, not broken, not lost in the ordinary careless way that shoelaces sometimes disappear. Just gone. Removed.
And sitting in that medical examiner's office, still looped around Kristine Larson's neck when she was brought in, was a thin white cord that the examiner had already noted was consistent with a shoelace.
Zimmerman laid it all out and looked at what he had. The phone books, the letters, the luminol results on the post, the vase, and the bedding, the missing shoelace. The cell phone tower data placed Zachary on I-94 westbound during the dump window. The gap in his phone activity during the window when Kristine arrived at his apartment, and the man matching his description was walking on the interstate in the dark.
Piece by piece, thread by thread, the picture had come together, and every single piece of it pointed in the same direction. It was time to bring Zachary Matthews back in. It was now just 2 days before Christmas. They thought a confession would be the best present. They didn't come at him with sirens, though.
That is not how it works when you have carefully built a case, brick by brick, and you don't want to give someone a reason to run or a moment to prepare. Zimmerman reached out to Daniel Tilson's family, Kristine's stepfather, and asked him to bring Zach in. Just for a follow-up interview, they said. It was routine, just a few more questions they needed to get through. And Daniel agreed. He had no reason not to. He had been cooperative from the beginning, the whole family had, because they wanted answers just as badly as the investigators did. He didn't know what was waiting on the other side of that drive.
Before they went in, Zimmerman pulled Daniel aside quietly, and he spoke carefully, keeping his voice low, choosing his words with precision. The precision of someone who needed to say something important without just letting it come out haphazardly. He told Daniel that they did not expect Zach to walk back out of that station. And Daniel said he figured that much. Zimmerman explained the reason he hadn't told Daniel earlier. He didn't want a shift in his demeanor. He didn't want anything that might tip off Zach before they got him back where they needed him. Daniel walked out of that station looking defeated. He lost his stepdaughter, and now he lost a person that he considered a son.
He didn't know that when he pulled into that parking lot and walked Zach through those doors, he was delivering the man who had probably killed his stepdaughter directly into the hands of the people who had spent the last several days trying to prove it. The interrogation room is a very peculiar kind of space. Small, deliberately plain, designed to remove distraction and create a pressure that builds slowly, without the person inside always being able to identify exactly where it's coming from. Zach sat down in that room, and at first, the temperature of the conversation was exactly what he had told to expect. Follow-up questions, routine, going back over things they had already covered.
Zimmerman kind of laughed lightheartedly, and he said that, we're back talking to you because I didn't take notes the first time, kind of putting it all back on him as the reason they had to call Zach back in. And it was right before the holidays and everything. But he repeated his story. He waited for Kristine that afternoon. She never showed up. And he told his story the same way he told it before. Steady, consistent, the account of someone who had nothing to add. Because there was nothing to add. But the questions got sharper. And then slowly, in the way that experienced interrogators do it, the conversation began to shift from the surface of what had happened to something deeper. Zach was no longer being treated like a cooperative witness, being asked to just fill in some details. He was being treated like someone at the center of everything, and he could feel it changing, even if he couldn't point to the exact moment it changed.
Yeah, it was probably when Zimmerman leaned in and made eye contact with Zach, and then he said, Zach, listen, we've been doing a lot of work on this case in the past few days. We've been talking to a lot of witnesses around where Kristine's body was found. We've been looking at your phone, and we know where you were that night, and we know that you're hiding things from us.
At which point, Zach snapped back at him and said, I'm not hiding anything. He was sobbing at points in this interrogation, insisting that he never hurt Kristine and that he can't believe they're accusing him of killing her. It sounds genuine. And that is why it's so hard when you watch or listen to these interviews. These people could be crying because they're sad for themselves, not because they're sad for the victims.
Zimmerman told him cell phone data doesn't lie. At one point, he tried to pivot to introduce a piece of logic he seemed to think would work in his favor. He argued that if he had done something to Kristine, he would have had to leave Darian alone in the apartment while he did it. And what kind of father, he asked, would you think I am to do that to my own child? What kind of person leaves their toddler alone? Where would his son have been then?
Zimmerman looked at him and didn't flinch. He told Zach that what mattered was not hypotheticals. What mattered was what he actually did, what actually happened, what Zach had done, and where he was, not his son. It was now good cop, bad cop from this point on. Zimmerman had warmed Zach up and riled him up as well. It was now Dietrich's turn to take a different approach. She sat with Zach in the way that a skilled investigator sits with people that's not confrontational, it's not cold, but it's genuine. She was kind and relatable, motherly almost. And I'm telling you right now, these two investigators made a great team. She acknowledged that it was just the two of them in there now, and she knew he was hurting. She let him sob. Then she said she knew how much he loved Kristine. She said she knew all about his background, the difficulty he had in his childhood, the circumstances he had come from, and she told him she understood all of that, and that loving someone was real, even when the things that came out of that love went somewhere they should never have gone. She held space for him in a way that sometimes, when everything else has failed, reaches something in a person, in a way that harder tactics can't even touch. She embraced him at one point. She even told him, not everyone that does something bad is a bad person. But Zach didn't break.
All the while, Zimmerman watched from the TV on the other side of the glass. Waiting to go back in, once Dietrich came out, it was his turn again. This time, when Zimmerman came back into the room, he had something with him. It was a coat for Zach. He said he was cold. It's a small gesture, the kind that changes the vibe of a room in ways that are hard to explain but easy to feel. And then he brought up the letters. He told Zach that he had read them, all of them, and that he wanted him to know genuinely that the letter he had found most affecting was the long one, the 2-page one, the one that laid everything out with rawness that was hard to read. He said it moved him.
But it had also exposed something. Because the man in those letters was not the man who was sitting in that room days earlier telling investigators he had moved on. The man in those letters was not someone at peace with how things had ended. The man in those letters was desperate and furious and consumed by a loss that he would not accept. And Zimmerman put those two versions of Zach side by side. The composed, resigned co-parent of the first interview and the shattered, resentful author of those letters. And he asked Zach to explain the distance between those two versions.
The composure that he had through so much of the interrogation began to fracture. He was spiraling. So it was time to push hard. Zimmerman laid out what he knew, not as a question, not as a theory, but as a fact, with a harsher, louder tone. He said, "We know you killed her, and you dumped her in Minneapolis." He told Zach about the phone records, about the gap, the hour and 5 minutes of silence in the otherwise unbroken record of activity, about when investigators believed Kristine had arrived at his apartment. 2:47, nothing. The phone went quiet at exactly the moment investigators believed Kristine walked through his door, when a rush of messages suddenly appeared as though someone was trying to fill the silence they had created.
He told him about the phone books, the stack in his living room, the burned ones back in the backseat of Kristine's car. He told him about the luminol, the wooden post, the vase that someone had scrubbed carefully enough to suggest they knew exactly why it needed to be clean, the blood on the bedding. He told him about the shoe and its missing lace. And Zach's face changed when Zimmerman said that. Something moved behind his eyes, a shift, a crack. And has just felt the whole structure shudder. He said he didn't know how any of that was possible. He said he wasn't there. He said he knew he wasn't there.
Yeah, Zimmerman told him that the cell phone towers knew differently. That's when Zach lashed out. The composure didn't just crack. It broke open into something raw and more volatile. And he said it the way someone says something when they're concerned or have run out of other options. He says, "So you're telling me I was talking to her mom while I was killing her? That's what you're saying." He framed it as absurd, as impossible, as an accusation of people who had gotten this completely wrong and were going to destroy an innocent man's life because they needed someone to blame.
Zimmerman didn't raise his voice. He didn't take the bait. He looked at Zach and he told him, "You're a liar and you know it." It was time for him to be a man, that his son was going to grow up asking questions, that the choices Zach made in this room right now were going to follow Darian for the rest of his life. He asked Zach what he wanted to do and what he wanted that to look like. And the room went silent. And that's when Zach's story changed. It wasn't an admission, not quite, but something shifted. And what came out next was a version of events so implausible that it told investigators almost as much as a confession would have. Through tears, Zach said, "I found her." And Dietrich embraced him as he cried into her shoulder, but Zimmerman didn't miss a beat. He's like, "Where did you find her, Zach?" His words were, "In the closet."
What?
Yeah. And that he came home and put her in the car and then kept driving.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's saying he just found her dead in the apartment.
Yes, he was saying that after taking Darian to the Christmas toy event, he came home to find Kristine already dead in his apartment closet. He said he panicked. He said he didn't kill her, but he found her already gone and he didn't know what to do. So he left Darian locked inside the apartment because he was already asleep and safe. And then he carried her body out to her car. He put her in the back seat and then he drove into the city. He said he didn't set a fire though. He said he just walked along the freeway. And after that, he felt zombie-ish. Those were his words. Before eventually catching a bus back to St. Paul. Zimmerman let him finish.
But Dietrich cut in. She said, "You're so close to telling us everything." And he said, I am not holding anything back." And that's when Zimmerman told him plainly that people do not simply find their ex-girlfriends dead in their closets, that this was not something that happened, that the evidence in his apartment told a different story than the one that Zach was now trying to spin. Zach had nothing left to offer. He didn't need to say another word. The evidence spoke for itself. They let him sit alone in silence. They knew what he did. They didn't know why, but they had their theories. Maybe it was jealousy, anger, rage.
Maybe Kristine decided she didn't want to go to the Christmas event with them. Whatever the reason, when Kristine came by that afternoon, she never left that apartment alive. What they knew was that Zach threw her against that wall and they had a struggle on his bed and he throttled her with that shoelace. As his anger intensified, he held tightly and then he loosened his grip, maybe enough to let her speak. Maybe because he was torn between loving her and hating her. But eventually he pulled and held until she took her very last breath. Then he took her to her car. He threw her in the back seat. He went back and grabbed the yellow pages, drove to that alley 30 minutes away, and tried to light her on fire.
They told him that Zach was going to be booked for murder. And Deborah broke down crying. Dan took the phone. You could hear her sobbing in the background. He thanked the detectives, and they went back to arrest him on the spot. Then they went to meet with Kristine's family in person. It was now Christmas Eve, and think about that. How does a family celebrate the holiday when all this is happening in their lives? Dan said it was like one of their children killed another one of their children. They loved Zach deeply, and they really thought he was going places. Deborah wanted Darian to remember he's a lot like his mama, and that Kristine loved both him and his dad. Deb shared something heartbreaking with the detectives. She said that when Darian came over with Zach after Kristine was murdered, he was distant, and he told her, "Mommy sad, Daddy bad."
What that little boy saw must have scarred him. It's sad. And Deborah said that every day when she sees Darian, she thinks of Kristine. It eases some of the pain, especially because he laughs like her and he was so adorable. I teared up when I was watching him like fist bump the detectives. And then the family set up a memorial fund. They needed to raise money for Darian's future, and their next step was trying to get full custody. In the meanwhile, Christmas passed, and on the 27th of December, Kristine's memorial ceremony and viewing happened. There was nowhere to even park. So many people were there. Friends, families, teachers, even strangers. They were piling into that funeral home, and it couldn't hold them all. But each one took their turn saying goodbye. Now, the charges against Zach were significant and deliberately layered to reflect both what had happened and the specific context in which it happened. Second-degree murder, first-degree premeditated murder, first-degree domestic abuse murder, a charge that acknowledged the history between Zach and Kristine. the pattern that existed long before December 19th, even if it had never been formally reported. Second-degree intentional murder and tampering with a body for that drive into that alley, the phone book, the fire, and the attempt to make everything disappear.
He was booked in the Hennepin County Jail. Bail was set at $1 million. The news of the arrest moved quickly for the community around Kristine, her friends, her colleagues, the people who had packed that funeral home. There was relief in it, that he was not still out there, that the answer, as devastating as it was an answer. He had been in their home in the days after Kristine's murder, sleeping under their roof, eating their food, holding their grandson. Deborah had comforted him, and Daniel had driven him to the police station. Daniel would later admit what those weeks had been like. The sleeplessness, the watching, the way you hold yourself together in front of a toddler who cannot understand what is happening, while something inside you is screaming. He said Deborah had allowed Zach to stay because of Darian, a price they had been willing to pay to make sure their grandson was safe.
Kristine's sister Michelle said that betrayal was beyond anything that she had words for. Her family had extended every kindness to this person. They had made room for him when he had nowhere to go. They had welcomed him and trusted him and treated him like one of their own. And this is what he gave them in return. There are no words. There still are no words. This case went to trial in October of 2008. Nearly a year had passed since Kristine was found in that alley. Nearly a year of legal proceedings, of the slow grind of the criminal justice system, moving towards the moment when a jury would finally sit in a room and decide what the rest of Zachary Matthews' life was going to look like. He had pleaded not guilty. Of course he did.
But the jury heard everything. The timeline, the phone records, the phone book sitting in his living room, identical to the ones charred and curling in the backseat of Kristine's car. The letters pulled from his hallway closet were obsessive, resentful, the words of a man who had told investigators he had moved on while privately writing about a world completely shattered, about being wronged, about doing everything in his power to get her back. The luminol results, the blood on the wooden post, the vase that had been scrubbed so carefully should have been cleaned, but wasn't. The blood on the bedding, the shoe with the missing lace, the one still looped around Kristine's neck, and the cell phone tower data. The prosecution also put before the jury the theory investigators had built piece by piece over the course of the investigation. That afternoon, on December 19th, Kristine had arrived at Zach's apartment late. She was supposed to be there at 2, so Zach was already upset. Then an argument had erupted. The detectives believed she may have said something final like, "Give me the baby, I'm leaving, you're not going to see him again," something that Zach could not bear to hear. And then he struck her, possibly with that heavy glass vase, and then strangled her with a shoelace. Then he left her there. Maybe in his closet, he said, then carried on his afternoon as though nothing had happened, taking Darian to the toy drive on the bus, texting Deborah a photograph of her grandson bundled up in his winter hat, building a paper trail of normalcy in real time. And that when he returned that evening, he put Kristine's body in her car, grabbed the phone books as kindling, drove to Minneapolis, abandoned the vehicle, set fire to it, and walked away, back along the interstate in the dark.
The jury also heard about the history, about what Dolce had told investigators, about Zach hitting Kristine harder than she had ever been hit by anyone, about the incident with Deborah, about his knowledge of Derek, and the way that knowledge had sat with him. And finally, the jury came back with their verdict. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, interference with a dead body, and Judge Lloyd Zimmerman looked at Zachary Matthews and sentenced him to life in prison, saying you will never see the light of day again.
Even in the lead up to that moment, Zach's defiance had been on full display. When it came time for the sentencing hearing, he refused to leave the jail, refused to come to court at all. The judge had to issue an order authorizing deputies to use whatever means necessary to bring him in, and when he finally appeared, he just sat with his head bowed, lifting it only once when his eyes found a photograph of his son somewhere in that courtroom. When he asked if he wanted to address the court, he said he had nothing to say. Nothing.
Deborah had prepared a victim impact statement. Now, the rules of the courtroom barred her from speaking directly to Zach, but every single word she said was meant for him, and everyone in that room knew it. She reminded the court how she and Daniel had taken him in when he had nothing. No family, no money, no stability, no direction. They had tried to help him to find his footing. They had rolled him in ROTC, believing he could make something out of himself. She talked about the night that he had threatened to jump from a bridge and how she had talked him down, how she hoped that she could help him choose life. And then her voice cracked. And then the grief turned into something else. She said, "You should have jumped. And you would have floated because you are a big piece of crap." Damn, but good for her. She told the court she was proud to be raising Darian. She thanked God that her grandson would never know the man his father truly was.
When it was over, Deborah said one question still haunted her. Why? After everything they've given him, after every open door and every second chance and every act of kindness this family had extended, why had he taken Kristine from them? She looked at him in that courtroom and said aloud, "All we ever did was help you. And all you ever did was take. And Zach said nothing. He's currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole.
It does not bring anyone back. It does not make December 19th unhappen. It does not put the ingredients back on that counter or make the cookies or fill the house with the sound of Kristine's laughter. What it does is close one chapter and leave the family to figure out how to live inside all the ones that follow. Deborah poured herself into him, into building a life for Darian, the kind of childhood that Kristine had wanted for her boy. Safe, warm, full of the love and laughter and belonging that had always defined the Larson-Tilson household.
She was determined, fiercely and completely determined, that Darian's life would not be defined by what his father had done. That he would know who his mother was, that he would grow up surrounded by people who had loved Kristine and who had loved him as the living extension of her. And he grew.
And then there was Christmas. As we mentioned, the ingredients for the Merry Christmas sat on that kitchen counter for months. Deborah could not bring herself to move them. Every time she walked into the kitchen, there they were, the chocolate chips, the licorice strings, the bag of almonds, exactly where she had laid them out on the counter on that afternoon of December 19th, when she was expecting her daughter to walk back through the front door. Each time she looked at them, a fresh wave of grief moved through her. Those simple, ordinary ingredients had become something else entirely, a wound that the calendar kept reopening. It wasn't until March of 2008, long after the Christmas lights had come down, long after the snow had melted along the roadside of St. Paul Park, that Deborah finally gathered the strength to move them. She stood in her kitchen with shaking hands and tucked each one of them back into the cupboard.
But she kept going because Kristine would have wanted her to, because Darian would have wanted her to. So Deborah pulled out the decorations days after her daughter was murdered. And the next year, when the wound was a bit more closed, she pulled out the ingredients and baked the cookies. She wrapped the presents. She did all of it with a heart that was not whole and would never be whole again. But she did it every year.
Because each act, however heavy it felt, was also a promise that Darian would grow up with the magic his mother had cherished and keep her memory alive, even if she wasn't. This is not just Kristine's story. It's a story of a lot of people who think their partner will change. If they say they're going to hurt you, or they do, it will only get worse. So please protect yourself. We will leave resources below for you. And we'll see you in our very next video. Bye.